Here a fresh locomotive and a Pullman car taking charge of them, they were whirled off to Omaha, reaching that busy locality at about supper time on the evening of December 16th. The Pacific train, as it was called though at that time, running no further west than Julesburg, instead of waiting for the regular hour of starting, fired up that very night, and was soon pulling the famous Baltimore Club men up the slopes of the Nebraska at the rate of 40 miles an hour. They were awakened before light next morning by the guard, who told them that Julesburg, which they were just entering, was the last point so far reached by the rails. But their regret at this circumstance was most unexpectedly and joyfully interrupted by finding their hands warmly clasped, and their names cheerily cried out by their old and beloved friend, J.T. Marston, the illustrious secretary of the Baltimore Gun Club. At the close of the first volume of our entertaining and veracious history, we left this most devoted friend and admirer of Barbicane established firmly at his post on the summit of Long's Peak, beside the great telescope, watching the skies, night and day, for some traces of his departed friends. There, as the gracious reader will also remember, he had come a little too late to catch that sight of the projectile which Belfast had at first reported so confidently, but of which the professor by degrees had begun to entertain the most serious doubts. In these doubts, however, Marston, strange to say, would not permit himself for one moment to share. Belfast might shake his head as much as he pleased. He, Marston, was no fickle reed to be shaken by every wind. He firmly believed the projectile to be there before him, actually in sight if he could only see it. All the long night of the 13th, and even for several hours of the 14th, he never quitted the telescope for a single instant. The midnight sky was in magnificent order. Not a speck dimmed its azure of an intensely dark tint. The stars blazed out like fires. The moon refused none of her secrets to the scientists who were gazing at her so intently that night from the platform on the summit of Long's Peak. But no black spot crawling over her resplendent surface rewarded their eager gaze. Marston indeed would occasionally utter a joyful cry announcing some discovery, but in a moment after he was confessing with groans that it was all a false alarm. Towards morning, Belfast gave up in despair and went to take a sleep, but no sleep for Marston, though he was now quite alone, the assistants having also retired. He kept on talking incessantly to himself, expressing the most unbounded confidence in the safety of his friends, and the absolute certainty of their return. It was not until some hours after the sun had risen, and the moon had disappeared behind the snowy peaks of the west, that he at last withdrew his weary eye from the glass through which every image formed by the great reflector was to be viewed. The countenance he turned on Belfast, who had now come back, was rueful in the extreme. It was the image of grief and despair. "Did you see nothing whatever during the night, Professor?" he asked of Belfast, though he knew very well the answer he was to get. "Nothing whatever." "But you saw them once, didn't you?" "Them's whose?" "Our friends." "Oh, the projectile. Well, I think I must have made some oversight." "Don't say that. Did not Mr. 1000 Connell see it also?" "No, he only wrote out what I dictated." "Why, you must have seen it. I have seen it myself." "You shall never see it again. It's shot off into space." "You're as wrong now as you thought you were right yesterday." "I'm sorry to say I was wrong yesterday, but I have every reason to believe I'm right today." "We shall see. Wait till tonight." "Tonight too late. As far as the projectile is concerned, night is now no better than day." The learned professor was quite right, but in a way which he did not exactly expect. That very evening, after a weary day, apparently a month long, during which Marston sought in vain for a few hours' repose, just as all hands, well wrapped up in warm furs, were getting ready to assume their posts once more near the mouth of the gigantic telescope, Mr. 1000 Connell hastily presented himself with a dispatch for Belfast. The professor was listlessly breaking the envelope when he uttered a sharp cry of surprise. "Hey," cried Marston quickly, "what's up now?" "Oh, the projectile." "What of it? What? Oh, what? Speak." "It's back." Marston uttered a wild yell of mingled horror, surprise and joy, jumped a little into the air, and then fell flat and motionless on the platform. Had Belfast shot him with a 10-pound weight, right between the two eyes, he could not have knocked him flatter or stiffer. Having neither slept all night, nor eaten all day, the poor fellow's system had become so weak that such unexpected news was really more than he could bear. Besides, as one of the Cambridge men of the party, a young medical student, remarked, The thin, cold air of these high mountains was extremely enervating. The astronomers, all exceedingly alarmed, did what they could to recover their friend from his fit, but it was nearly 10 minutes before they had the satisfaction of seeing his limbs moving with a slight quiver and his breast beginning to heave. At last the colour came back to his face and his eyes opened. He stared around for a few seconds at his friends, evidently unconscious, but his senses were not long in returning. "Say," he uttered at last in a faint voice. "Well," replied Belfast, "where is that infernal projectile?" "In the Pacific Ocean." "What?" He was on his feet in an instant. "Say that again." "In the Pacific Ocean." "Hurrah, all right, old Barbican's not made into mincemeat yet. No, sirree, let's start." "Where for?" "San Francisco." "When?" "This instant." "In the dark." "We shall soon have the light of the moon. Curse her, it's the least she can do after all the trouble she has given us." Chapter 22. On the Wings of the Wind. Leaving 1000 Connell and a few other Cambridge men to take charge of the great telescope, Marston and Belfast, in little more than an hour after the receipt of the exciting dispatch, were scudding down the slopes of Long's Peak by the only possible route, the inclined railroad. This mode of travelling, however, highly satisfactory as far as it went, ceased altogether at the mountain foot, at the point where the Dale River formed a junction with Cache La Powder Creek. But Marston, having already mapped out the whole journey with some care and forethought, was ready for almost every emergency, instinctively feeling that the first act of the Baltimore Gun Club would be to send a committee to San Francisco to investigate matters. He had determined to meet this deputation on the route, and his only trouble now was to determine at what point he would be most likely to catch them. His great start, he knew perfectly well, could not put him more than a day in advance of them, they having the advantage of a railroad nearly all the way, whilst himself and Belfast could not help losing much time in struggling through ravines, canyons, mountain precipices, and densely tangled forests, not to mention the possibility of a brush or two with prowling Indians, before they could strike the line of the Pacific Railroad, along which he knew the club men to be approaching. After a few hours' rest at La Porte, a little settlement lately started in the valley. Early in the morning they took the stage that passed through from Denver to Cheyenne, a town at that time hardly a year old but already flourishing, with a busy population of several thousand inhabitants. Losing not a moment at Cheyenne, where they arrived much sooner than they had anticipated, they took places in Wells, Fargo and Coe's overland stage mail bound east, and were soon flying towards Julesburg at the rate of 12 miles an hour. Here Marston was anxious to meet the club men, as at this point the Pacific Railroad divided into two branches, one bearing north, the other south of the Great Salt Lake, and he feared they might take the wrong one. But he arrived in Julesburg fully 10 hours before the committee, so that himself and Belfast had not only ample time to rest a little after their rapid flight from Long's Peak, but also to make every possible preparation for the terrible journey of more than 1,500 miles that still lay before them. This journey, undertaken at a most unseasonable period of the year, and over one of the most terrible deserts in the world, would require a volume for itself, constantly presenting the sharpest points of contrast between the most savage features of wild barbaric nature on the one hand, and the most touching traits of the sweetest humanity on the other. The story of our club men's adventures, if only well told, could hardly fail to be highly interesting. But instead of a volume, we can give it only a chapter, and that a short one. From Julesburg, the last station on the eastern end of the Pacific Railroad, to Cisco, the last station on its western end, the distance is probably about 1,500 miles, about as far as Constantinople is from London, or Moscow from Paris. This enormous stretch of country had to be travelled all the way by, at the best, a 6-horse stage tearing along night and day at a uniform rate, road or no road, of 10 miles an hour. But this was the least of the trouble. Bands of hostile Indians were a constant source of watchfulness and trouble, against which even a most liberal stock of rifles and revolvers were not always a reassurance. Whirlwinds of dust often overwhelmed the travellers so completely that they could hardly tell day from night, whilst blasts of icy chill, sweeping down from the snowy peaks of the Rocky Mountains, often made them imagine themselves in the midst of the horrors of an Arctic winter. The predominant scenery gave no pleasure to the eye or exhilaration to the mind. It was of the dreariest description, Days and days passed with hardly a house to be seen, or a tree or a blade of grass, I might even add, or a mountain or a river, for the one was too often a heap of agglomerated sand and clay cut into unsightly chasms by the rain, and the other generally degenerated into a mere stagnant swamp, its shallowness and dryness increasing regularly with its length. The only houses were log ranches called relays, hardly visible in their sandy surroundings, and separate from each other by a mean distance of 10 miles. The only trees were either stunted cedars, so far apart as to be often denominated lone trees, and besides wormwood, the only plant was the sage plant, about 2 feet high, grey, dry, crisp, and emitting a sharp pungent odour by no means pleasant. In fact, Barbicane and his companions had seen nothing drearier or savager in the dreariest and savagest of lunar landscapes than the scenes occasionally presented to Marston and his friends in their headlong journey on the track of the Great Pacific Railroad. Here boulders, high, square, straight and plumb as an immense hotel, blocked up your way. There lay an endless level, flat as the palm of your hand, over which your eye might roam in vain in search of something green like a meadow, yellow like a cornfield, or black like ploughed ground, a mere boundless waste of dirty white from the stunted wormwood, often rendered misty with the clouds of smarting alkali dust. Occasionally, however, this savage scenery decidedly changed its character. Now a lovely glen would smile before our travellers, traversed by tinkling streams, waving with sweet grasses, dotted with little groves, alive with hares, antelopes, and even elks, but apparently never yet trodden by the foot of man. Now our clubmen felt like travelling on clouds, as they careered along the great plateau west of the Black Hills, fully 8,000 feet above the level of the sea, though even there the grass was as green and fresh as if it grew in some sequestered valley of Pennsylvania. Again, in this untravelled world whose margin fades, forever and forever as they moved, they would find themselves in an immense, tawny, treeless plain, outlined by mountains so distant as to resemble fantastic cloud piles. Here for days they would have to skirt the coasts of a lake, vast, unruffled, unrippled, apparently of metallic consistency, from whose sapphire depths rose pyramidal islands to a height of fully 3,000 feet above the surface. In a few days all would change. No more sand wastes, salt-water flats, or clouds of blinding alkali dust. The travellers' road at the foot of black precipitous cliffs would wind along the brink of a roaring torrent, whose devious course would lead them into the heart of the Sierras, where misty peaks solemnly sentineled the nestling vales still smiling in genial summer verdure. Across these they were often whirled through immense forests of varied character, here dense enough to obscure the track, there swaying in the sweet sunlight and vocal with joyous birds of bright and gorgeous plumage. Then tropical vegetation would completely hide the trail, crystal lakes would obstruct it, cascades shooting down from perpendicular rocks would obliterate it, mountain passes barricaded by basaltic columns would render it uncertain, and on one occasion it was completely covered up by a fall of snow to a depth of more than 20 feet. But nothing could oppose serious delay to our travellers. Their motto was ever onward, and what they lost in 1 hour by some mishap, they endeavoured to recover on the next by redoubled speed. They felt that they would be no friends of Barbicane's if they were discouraged by impossibilities. Besides, what would have been real impossibilities at another time, several concurrent circumstances now rendered comparatively easy. The surveys, the gradings, the cuttings, and the other preliminary labours in the Great Pacific Railroad gave them incalculable aid. Horses, help, carriages, provisions were always in abundance. Their object being well known, they had the best wishes of every hand on the road. People remained up for them all hours of the night, no matter at what station they were expected. The warmest and most comfortable of meals were always ready for them, for which no charge would be taken on any account. In Utah, a deputation of Mormons galloped alongside them for 40 miles to help them over some points of the road that had been often found difficult. The season was the finest known for many years. In short, as an old Californian said as he saw them shooting over the rickety bridge that crossed the Bear River at Careen, they had everything in their favour, luck as well as pluck. The rate at which they performed this terrible ride across the continent, and the progress they made each day, some readers may consider worthy of a few more items for the sake of future reference. Discarding the ordinary overland mail stage as altogether too slow for their purpose, they hired at Julesburg a strong, well-built carriage, large enough to hold them all comfortably. But this they had to replace twice before they came to their journey's end. Their team always consisted of the best 6 horses that could be found, and their driver was the famous Hank Monk of California, who, happening to be in Julesburg about that time, volunteered to see them safely landed in Cisco on the summit of the Sierra Nevada. They were enabled to change horses as near as possible every hour, by telegraphing ahead in the morning, during the day, and often far into the hours of night. Starting from Julesburg early in the morning of the 17th, their first resting place for a few hours at night was Granite Canyon, 20 miles west of Cheyenne, and just at the foot of the pass over the Black Hills. On the 18th, nightfall found them entering St. Mary's, at the further end of the pass between Rattlesnake Hills and Elk Mountain. It was after 5 o'clock and already dark on the 19th, when the travelers, hurrying with all speed through the gloomy gorge of slate formation leading to the banks of the Green River, found the ford too deep to be ventured before morning. The 20th was a clear cold day, very favorable for brisk locomotion, and the bright sun had not quite disappeared behind the Wasatch Mountains when the clubmen, having crossed the Bear River, began to leave the lofty plateau of the Rocky Mountains by the great inclined plane marked by the lines of the Echo and the Weber Rivers on their way to the valley of the Great American Desert. Quitting Castle Rock early on the morning of the 21st, they soon came in sight of the Great Salt Lake, along the northern shores of which they sped all day, taking shelter after nightfall at Terrace, in a miserable log cabin surrounded by piles of drifting sand. The 22d was a terrible day. The sand was blinding, the alkali dust choking, the ride for 5 or 6 hours was up considerable grade. Still, they had accomplished their 150 miles before resting for the night at Elko, even at this period, a flourishing little village on the banks of the Humboldt. After another smothering ride on the 23d, they rested at Winnemucca, another flourishing village, situated at the precise point in the desert where the little Humboldt joins Humboldt River, without, however, making the channel fuller or wider. The 24th was decidedly the hardest day, their course lying through the worst part of the terrible Nevada desert, but a glimpse of the Sierras looming in the western horizon gave them courage and strength enough to reach Wadsworth, at their foot, a little before midnight. Our travelers had now but one day's journey more to make before reaching the railroad at Cisco, but this being a very steep ascent nearly all the way up, each mile cost almost twice as much time and exertion. At last, late in the evening of Christmas Day, amidst the most enthusiastic cheers of all the inhabitants of Cisco, who welcomed them with a splendid pine-brand procession, Marston and his friends, thoroughly used up, feet swelled, limbs bruised, bones aching, stomachs seasick, eyes bleared, ears ringing, and brains on fire for want of rest, took their places in the state car waiting for them, and started without a moment's delay for Sacramento, about 100 miles distant. How delicious was the change to our poor travelers! Washed, refreshed, and lying at full length on luxurious sofas, their sensations, as the locomotive spun them down the ringing grooves of the steep Sierras, can be more easily imagined than described. They were all fast asleep when the train entered Sacramento, but the mayor and the other city authorities who had waited up to receive them had them carried carefully, so as not to disturb their slumbers, on board the Yosemite, a fine steamer belonging to the California Navigation Company, which landed them safely at San Francisco about noon on the 26th, after accomplishing the extraordinary winter journey of 1,500 miles over land in little more than 9 days, only about 200 miles being done by steam. 2:30 p.m. found our travelers bathed, dressed, shaved, dined, and ready to receive company in the grand parlor of the Occidental Hotel. Captain Bloomsbury was the first to call. Marston hobbled eagerly towards him and asked, "What have you done towards fishing them up, Captain?" "A good deal, Mr. Marston. Indeed, almost everything is ready." "Is that really the case, Captain?" asked all, very agreeably surprised. "Yes, gentlemen, I am most happy to state that I am quite in earnest." "Can we start tomorrow?" asked General Morgan. "We have not a moment to spare, you know." "We can start at noon tomorrow at latest," replied the captain, "if the foundry men do a little extra work tonight." "We must start this very day, Captain Bloomsbury," cried Marston resolutely. "Barbican has been lying 2 weeks and 13 hours in the depths of the Pacific. If he is still alive, no thanks to Marston, he must by this time have given me up. The grappling irons must be got on board at once, Captain, and let us start this evening." At 4:30 that very evening, a shot from the fort and a lowering of the stars and stripes from its flagstaff saluted the Susquehanna, as she steamed proudly out of the Golden Gate at the lively rate of 15 knots an hour. Chapter 23. The club men go a-fishing. Captain Bloomsbury was perfectly right when he said that almost everything was ready for the commencement of the great work which the club men had to accomplish. Considering how much was required, this was certainly saying a great deal. But here also, as on many other occasions, fortune had singularly favored the club men. San Francisco Bay, as everybody knows, though one of the finest and safest harbors in the world, is not without some danger from hidden rocks. One of these in particular, the Anita Rock as it was called, lying right in mid-channel, had become so notorious for the wrecks of which it was the cause, that, after much time spent in the consideration of the subject, the authorities had at last determined to blow it up. This undertaking having been very satisfactorily accomplished by means of dynamite or giant powder, another improvement in the harbour had been also undertaken with great success. The wrecks of many vessels lay scattered here and there pretty numerously, some, like that of the Flying Dragon, in spots so shallow that they could be easily seen at low water, but others sunk at least 20 fathoms deep, like that of the Caroline, which had gone down in 1851, not far from Blossom Rock, with a treasure on board of 20,000 ounces of gold. The attempt to clear away these wrecks had also turned out very well. Even sufficient treasure had been recovered to repay all the expense, though the preparations for the purpose by the contractors, 1000 Gowan & Co., had been made on the most extensive scale, and in accordance with the latest improvements in the apparatus for submarine operations. Buoys made of huge canvas sacks, coated with India rubber and guarded by a network of strong cordage, had been manufactured and provided by the New York Submarine Company. These buoys, when inflated and working in pairs, had a lifting capacity of 30 tons a pair. Reservoirs of air, provided with powerful compression pumps, always accompanied the buoys. To attach the latter in a collapsed condition, with strong chains to the sides of the vessels which were to be lifted, a diving apparatus was necessary. This also the New York Company had provided, and it was so perfect in its way that, by means of peculiar appliances of easy management, the diver could walk about on the bottom, take his own bearings, ascend to the surface at pleasure, and open his helmet without assistance. A few sets likewise of Rouquayrol and Denerou's famous submarine armor had been provided. These would prove of invaluable advantage in all operations performed at great sea depths, as its distinctive feature, the regulator, could maintain, what is not done by any other diving armor, a constant equality of pressure on the lungs between the external and the internal air. But perhaps the most useful article of all was a new form of diving bell called the Nautilus, a kind of submarine boat, capable of lateral as well as vertical movement at the will of its occupants. Constructed with double sides, the intervening chambers could be filled either with water or air according as descent or ascent was required. A proper supply of water enabled the machine to descend to depths impossible to be reached otherwise. This water could then be expelled by an ingenious contrivance, which, replacing it with air, enabled the diver to rise towards the surface as fast as he pleased. All these and many other portions of the submarine apparatus, which had been employed that very year for clearing the channel, lifting the wrecks and recovering the treasure, lay now at San Francisco, unused fortunately on account of the season of the year, and therefore they could be readily obtained for the asking. They had even been generously offered to Captain Bloomsbury, who, in obedience to a telegram from Washington, had kept his crew busily employed for nearly 2 weeks night and day in transferring them all safely on board the Susquehanna. Marston was the first to make a careful inspection of every article intended for the operation. "Do you consider these buoys powerful enough to lift the projectile, Captain?" he asked next morning, as the vessel was briskly heading southward, at a distance of 10 or 12 miles from the coast on their left. "You can easily calculate that problem yourself, Mr. Marston," replied the captain. "It presents no difficulty. The projectile weighs about 20,000 pounds or 10 tons. "Correct." "Well, a pair of these buoys, when inflated, can raise a weight of 30 tons. "So far so good, but how do you propose attaching them to the projectile?" "We simply let them descend in a state of collapse. The diver, going down with them, will have no difficulty in making a fast connection. As soon as they are inflated, the projectile will come up like a cork." "Can the divers readily reach such depths?" "That remains to be seen, Mr. Marston." "Captain," said Morgan, now joining the party, "you are a worthy member of our gun club. You have done wonders. Heaven grant it may not be all in vain. Who knows if our poor friends are still alive?" "Hush," cried Marston quickly. "Have more sense than to ask such questions. Is Barbican alive? Am I alive? They're all alive, I tell you, only we must be quick about reaching them before the air gives out. That's what's the matter. Air, provisions, water, abundance. But air, oh, that's their weak point. Quick, Captain, quick, they're throwing the reel, I must see her rate. So saying, he hurried off to the stern, followed by General Morgan. Chief Engineer Murphy and the captain of the Susquehanna were thus left for a while together. These two men had a long talk on the object of their journey and the likelihood of anything satisfactory being accomplished. The man of the sea candidly acknowledged his apprehensions. He had done everything in his power towards collecting suitable machinery for fishing up the projectile, but he had done it all, he said, more as a matter of duty than because he believed that any good could result from it. In fact, he never expected to see the bold adventurers again, either living or dead. Murphy, who well understood not only what machinery was capable of effecting, but also what it would surely fail in, at first expressed the greatest confidence in the prosperous issue of the undertaking. But when he learned, as he now did for the first time, that the ocean bed on which the projectile was lying could be hardly less than 20,000 feet below the surface, he assumed a countenance as grave as the captain's, and at once confessed that, unless their usual luck stood by them, his poor friends had not the slightest possible chance of ever being fished up from the depths of the Pacific. The conversation maintained among the officers and the others on board the Susquehanna was pretty much of the same nature. It is almost needless to say that all heads, except Belfast's, whose scientific mind rejected the projectile theory with the most serene contempt, were filled with the same idea. All hearts throbbed with the same emotion. Wouldn't it be glorious to fish them up alive and well? What were they doing just now? Doing. Their bodies most probably were lying in a shapeless pile on the floor of the projectile, like a heap of clothes, the uppermost man being the last smothered, or perhaps floating about in the water inside the projectile, like dead goldfish in an aquarium, or perhaps burned to a cinder, like papers in a champion safe after a great fire, or, who knows, perhaps at that very moment the poor fellows were making their last and almost superhuman struggles to burst their watery prison and ascend once more into the cheerful regions of light and air. Alas, how vain must such puny efforts prove! Plunged into ocean depths of 3 or 4 miles beneath the surface, subjected to an inconceivable pressure of millions and millions of tons of sea water, their metallic shroud was utterly unassailable from within, and utterly unapproachable from without. Early on the morning of December 29th, the captain, calculating from his log that they must now be very near the spot where they had witnessed the extraordinary phenomenon, the Susquehanna hove to. Having to wait till noon to find his exact position, he ordered the steamer to take a short circular course of a few hours' duration, in hope of sighting the buoy. But though at least 100 telescopes scanned the calm ocean breast for many miles in all directions, it was nowhere to be seen. Precisely at noon, aided by his officers, and in the presence of Marston, Belfast, and the Gun Club Committee, the captain took his observations. After a moment or two of the most profound interest, it was a great gratification to all to learn that the Susquehanna was on the right parallel, and only about 15 miles west of the precise spot where the projectile had disappeared beneath the waves. The steamer started at once in the direction indicated, and a minute or two before 1 o'clock the captain said they were there. No sign of the buoy could yet be seen in any direction. It had probably been drifted southward by the Mexican coast current, which slowly glides along these shores from December to April. At last, cried Marston with a sigh of great relief. "Shall we commence at once?" asked the captain. "Without losing the 20,000th part of a second," answered Marston. "Life or death depends upon our dispatch." The Susquehanna again hove to, and this time all possible precautions were taken to keep her in a state of perfect immobility, an operation easily accomplished in these Pacific latitudes, where cloud and wind and water are often as motionless as if all life had died out of the world. In fact, as the boats were quietly lowered preparatory for beginning the operations, the mirror-like calmness of sea, sky, and ship so impressed the doctor, who was of a poetical turn of mind, that he could not help exclaiming to the little midshipman, who was standing nearest. Coleridge realized with variations. The breeze drops down, the sail drops down. All still as still can be. If we speak, it is only to break the silence of the sea. Still are the clouds, still are the shrouds. No life, no breath, no motion. Idle are all as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. Chief Engineer Murphy now took command, Before letting down the buoys, the first thing evidently to be done was to find out, if possible, the precise point where the projectile lay. For this purpose, the Nautilus was clearly the only part of the machinery that could be employed with advantage. Its chambers were accordingly soon filled with water, its air reservoirs were also soon completely charged, and the Nautilus itself, suspended by chains from the end of a yard, lay quietly on the ocean's surface, its manhole on the top remaining open for the reception of those who were willing to encounter the dangers that awaited it in the fearful depths of the Pacific. Everyone looking on was well aware that, after a few hundred feet below the surface, the pressure would grow more and more enormous, until at last it became quite doubtful if any line could bear the tremendous strain. It was even possible that at a certain depth the walls of the Nautilus might be crushed in like an eggshell, and the whole machine made as flat as 2 leaves of paper pasted together. Perfectly conscious of the nature of the tremendous risk they were about to run, Marston, Morgan, and Murphy quietly bade their friends a short farewell and were lowered into the manhole. The Nautilus having room enough for 4, Belfast had been expected to be of the party, but feeling a little seasick, the professor backed out at the last moment, to the great joy of Mr. Watkins, the famous reporter of the NY Herald, who was immediately allowed to take his place. Every provision against immediate danger had been made. By means of preconcerted signals, the inmates could have themselves drawn up, let down, or carried laterally in whatever direction they pleased. By barometers and other instruments they could readily ascertain the pressure of the air and water, also how far they had descended, and at what rate they were moving. The captain, from his bridge, carefully superintended every detail of the operation. All signals he insisted on attending to himself personally, transmitting them instantly by his bell to the engineer below. The whole power of the steam engine had been brought to bear on the windlass. The chains could withstand an enormous strain. The wheels had been carefully oiled and tested beforehand. The signalling apparatus had been subjected to the rigidest examination, and every portion of the machinery had been proved to be in admirable working order. The chances of immediate and unforeseen danger, it is true, had been somewhat diminished by all these precautions. The risk, nevertheless, was fearful. The slightest accident or even carelessness might easily lead to the most disastrous consequence. 5 minutes after 2 o'clock, the manhole being closed, the lamps lit, and everything pronounced all right, the signal for the descent was given, and the Nautilus immediately disappeared beneath the waters. A double anxiety now possessed all on board the Susquehanna. The prisoners in the Nautilus were in danger as well as the prisoners in the projectile. Marston and his friends, however, were anything but disquieted on their own account, and, pencil in hand and noses flattened on the glass plates, they examined carefully everything they could see in the liquid masses through which they were descending. For the first 500 feet, the descent was accomplished with little trouble. The Nautilus sank rather slowly, at a uniform rate of a foot to the second. It had not been 2 minutes under water when the light of day completely disappeared, but for this the occupants were fully prepared, having provided themselves with powerful lamps, whose brilliant light, radiating from polished reflectors, gave them an opportunity of seeing clearly around it for a distance of 8 or 10 feet in all directions. Owing to the superlatively excellent construction of the Nautilus, also on account of the scaphanders, or suits of diving armor, with which Marston and his friends had clothed themselves, the disagreeable sensations to which divers are ordinarily exposed were hardly felt at all in the beginning of the descent. Marston was about to congratulate his companions on the favourable auspices inaugurating their trip, when Murphy, consulting the instrument, discovered to his great surprise that the Nautilus was not making its time. In reply to their signal, faster, the downward movement increased a little, but it soon relaxed again. Instead of less than 2 minutes, as at the beginning, it now took 12 minutes to make 100 feet. They had gone only 700 feet in 37 minutes. In spite of repeated signalling, their progress during the next hour was even still more alarming, 100 feet taking exactly 59 minutes. To shorten detail, it required 2 hours more to make another 100 feet, and then the Nautilus, after taking 10 minutes to crawl an inch further, came to a perfect standstill. The pressure of the water had evidently now become too enormous to allow further descent. The clubmen's distress was very great. Marston's in particular was indescribable. In vain catching at straws, he signalled eastwards, westwards, northwards, or southwards. The Nautilus moved readily every way but downwards. "Oh, what shall we do?" he cried in despair. "Barbicane, must we really give you up, though separated from us by the short distance of only a few miles?" At last, nothing better being to be done, the unwilling signal, "Heave upwards," was given and the hauling up commenced. It was done very slowly and with the greatest care. A sudden jerk might snap the chains, an incautious twist might put a kink on the air tube. Besides, it was well known that the sudden removal of heavy pressure resulting from rapid ascent is attended by very disagreeable sensations, which have sometimes even proved fatal. It was near midnight when the clubmen were lifted out of the manhole. Their faces were pale, their eyes bloodshot, their figures stooped. Even the Herald reporter seemed to have got enough of exploring, but Marston was as confident as ever and tried to be as brisk. He had hardly swallowed the refreshment so positively enjoined in the circumstances, when he abruptly addressed the captain. "What's the weight of your heaviest cannon balls?" "30 pounds, Mr. Marston." "Can't you attach 30 of them to the Nautilus and sink us again?" "Certainly, Mr. Marston, if you wish it. It shall be the first thing done tomorrow." "Tonight, Captain, at once. Barbican has not an instant to lose." "At once then be it, Mr. Marston, just as you say." The new sinkers were soon attached to the Nautilus, which disappeared once more with all its former occupants inside, except the Herald reporter, who had fallen asleep over his notes, or at least seemed to be. He had probably made up his mind as to the likelihood of the Nautilus ever getting back again. The second descent was quicker than the first, but just as futile. At 1152 feet, the Nautilus positively refused to go a single inch further. Marston looked like a man in a stupor. He made no objection to the signal given by the others to return. He even helped to cut the ropes by which the cannon balls had been attached. Not a single word was spoken by the party as they slowly rose to the surface. Marston seemed to be struggling against despair. For the first time, the impossibility of the great enterprise seemed to dawn upon him. He and his friends had undertaken a great fight with the mighty ocean, which now played with them as a giant with a pygmy. To reach the bottom was evidently completely out of their power, and what was infinitely worse, there was nothing to be gained by reaching it. The projectile was not on the bottom, it could not even have got to the bottom. Marston said it all in a few words to the captain, as the clubmen stepped on deck a few hours later. "Barbican is floating midway in the depths of the Pacific, like Mahomet in his coffin." Blindly yielding, however, to the melancholy hope that is born of despair, Marston and his friends renewed the search next day, the 30th, but they were all too worn out with watching and excitement to be able to continue it longer than a few hours. After a night's rest, it was renewed the day following, the 31st, with some vigor, and a good part of the ocean lying between Guadeloupe and Bonito Islands was carefully investigated to a depth of 700 or 800 feet. No traces whatever of the projectile. Several California steamers, plying between San Francisco and Panama, passed the Susquehanna within hailing distance, but to every question, the invariable reply one melancholy burden bore: "No luck." All hands were now in despair. Marston could neither eat nor drink. He never even spoke the whole day except on 2 occasions, once when somebody heard him muttering, "He's now 17 days in the ocean." The second time he spoke, the words seemed to be forced out of him. Belfast admitted for the sake of argument that the projectile had fallen into the ocean, but he strongly denounced the absurd idea of its occupants being still alive. Under such circumstances, went on the learned professor, further prolongation of vital energy would be simply impossible. Want of air, want of food, want of courage. "No, sir," interrupted Marston quite savagely. "Want of air, of meat, of drink, as much as you like. But when you speak of Barbican's want of courage, you don't know what you are talking about. No holy martyr ever died at the stake with a loftier courage than my noble friend Barbican." That night he asked the captain if he would not sail down as far as Cape San Lucas. Bloomsbury saw that further search was all labour lost, but he respected such heroic grief too highly to give a positive refusal. He consented to devote the following day, New Year's, to an exploring expedition as far as Magdalena Bay, making the most diligent inquiries in all directions. But New Year's was just as barren of results as any of its predecessors, and a little before sunset, Captain Bloomsbury, regardless of further entreaties and unwilling to risk further delay, gave orders to bout ship and return to San Francisco. The Susquehanna was slowly turning around in obedience to her wheel, as if reluctant to abandon forever a search in which humanity at large was interested, when the lookout man, stationed in the forecastle, suddenly sang out, "A buoy to the northeast, not far from shore." All telescopes were instantly turned in the direction indicated. The buoy, or whatever object it was, could be readily distinguished. It certainly did look like one of those buoys used to mark out the channel that ships follow when entering a harbour, but as the vessel slowly approached it, a small flag, flapping in the dying wind, a strange feature in a buoy, was seen to surmount its cone, which a nearer approach showed to be emerging 4 or 5 feet from the water. And for a buoy too, it was exceedingly bright and shiny, reflecting the red rays of the setting sun as strongly as if its surface was crystal or polished metal. "Call Mr. Marston on deck at once," cried the captain, his voice betraying unwanted excitement as he put the glass again to his eye. Marston, thoroughly worn out by his incessant anxiety during the day, had been just carried below by his friends, and they were now trying to make him take a little refreshment and repose. But the captain's order brought them all on deck like a flash. They found the whole crew gazing in one direction, and, though speaking in little more than whispers, evidently in a state of extraordinary excitement. What could all this mean? Was there any ground for hope? The thought sent a pang of delight through Marston's wildly beating heart that almost choked him. The captain beckoned to the club men to take a place on the bridge beside himself. They instantly obeyed, all quietly yielding them a passage. The vessel was now only about a quarter of a mile distant from the object, and therefore near enough to allow it to be distinguished without the aid of a glass. What? The flag bore the well-known stars and stripes. An electric shudder of glad surprise shot through the assembled crowd. They still spoke, however, in whispers, hardly daring to utter their thoughts aloud. The silence was suddenly startled by a howl of mingled ecstasy and rage from Marston. He would have fallen off the bridge, had not the others held him firmly. Then he burst into a laugh loud and long, and quite as formidable as his howl. Then he tore away from his friends, and began beating himself over the head. "Oh," he cried in accents between a yell and a groan, "what chuckleheads we are, what numbskulls, what jackasses, what double-treble-barreled gibbering idiots." Then he fell to beating himself over the head again. "What's the matter, Marston, for heaven's sake?" cried his friends, vainly trying to hold him. "Speak for yourself," cried others, Belfast among the number. "No exception, Belfast, you're as bad as the rest of us. We're all a set of unmitigated, demoralized, dog-goned old lunatics. Ha, ha, ha." "Speak plainly, Marston, tell us what you mean." "I mean," roared the terrible secretary, "that we are no better than a lot of cabbage heads, dead-beats and frauds, calling ourselves scientists. Oh, Barbican, how you must blush for us. If we were schoolboys, we should all be skinned alive for our ignorance. Do you forget you heard of ignoramuses that the projectile weighs only 10 tons? "We don't forget it, we know it well. What of it?" "This of it, it can't sink in water without displacing its own volume in water. Its own volume in water weighs 30 tons. Consequently, it can't sink, more consequently, it hasn't sunk, and most consequently, there it is before us, bobbing up and down all the time under our very noses. Oh, Barbican, how can we ever venture to look at you straight in the face again?" Marston's extravagant manner of showing it did not prevent him from being perfectly right. With all their knowledge of physics, not a single one of those scientific gentlemen had remembered the great fundamental law that governs sinking or floating bodies. Thanks to its slight specific gravity, the projectile, after reaching unknown depths of ocean through the terrific momentum of its fall, had been at last arrested in its course and even obliged to return to the surface. By this time, all the passengers of the Susquehanna could easily recognize the object of such weary longings and desperate searches, floating quietly a short distance before them in the last rays of the declining day. The boats were out in an instant. Marston and his friends took the captain's gig. The rowers pulled with a will towards the rapidly nearing projectile. What did it contain, the living or the dead? The living certainly, as Marston whispered to those around him, otherwise how could they have ever run up that flag? The boats approached in perfect silence, all hearts throbbing with the intensity of newly awakened hope, all eyes eagerly watching for some sign to confirm it. No part of the windows appeared over the water, but the trap hole had been thrown open, and through it came the pole that bore the American flag. Marston made for the trap hole, and as it was only a few feet above the surface, he had no difficulty in looking in. At that moment, a joyful shout of triumph rose from the interior, and the whole boat's crew heard a dry, drawling voice with a nasal twang exclaiming, "Queen, how is that for high?" It was instantly answered by another voice, shriller, louder, quicker, more joyous and triumphant in tone, but slightly tinged with a foreign accent. "King, my brave Mac, how is that for high?" The deep, clear, calm voice that spoke next thrilled the listeners outside with an emotion that we shall not attempt to portray. Except that their ears could detect in it the faintest possible emotion of triumph, it was in all respects as cool, resolute, and self-possessed as ever. "Ace, dear friends, how is that for high?" They were quietly enjoying a little game of high-low jack. "How is that for high? How is that for high?" How they must have been startled by the wild cheers that suddenly rang around their ocean prison. How madly were these cheers re-echoed from the decks of the Susquehanna. Who can describe the welcome that greeted these long-lost, long-beloved, long-despaired-of sons of earth, now so suddenly and unexpectedly rescued from destruction, and restored once more to the wonder-stricken eyes of admiring humanity? Who can describe the scenes of joy and exuberant happiness, and deep-felt gratitude, and roaring rollicking merriment, that were witnessed on board the steamer that night, and during the next 3 days?